John Schneider has some thoughts about how the Seahawks should build their offensive line. What's going on, everybody? Good morning. Happy Saturday. We have made it to the weekend here, and we've got some Seahawks stuff to talk about. We've got more free agency stuff to get into later today. Going to be doing more wide receivers, but before we get there, I wanted to go ahead and talk about I'd call it a somewhat hot topic in the Seahawks fan base right now. John Schneider went on Seattle Sports yesterday and talked about some stuff. It's kind of old news at this point, but I didn't feel like making a video right when it happened, partially because I wanted to give it a little bit of time to settle, also because I already had my videos set up and ready to go at that point, so decided to let it go. This video is powered by BetUS. So, John Schneider goes on Seattle Sports Radio and is asked some questions about his approach this offseason and gave some answers where he has some pretty good things to say, some interesting things to say. I don't know if I would bet anything on him being completely forthcoming. You would think that he wouldn't be. You would think it would be beneficial to not have people know what you're going to do, but at the same time, it's not like anybody's going to believe him, right? You would think that you could say whatever you want to say, truth or lies, and either people are going to believe it or they're not going to believe it, but more than likely people are just going to assume that you're not being completely honest, and they're not going to know what parts to believe and what parts not to believe. So I don't know how much we should be reading into this here, but look, he said a few different things, and some of it is just kind of matter of fact. Like, they asked him about the salary cap situation for the Seahawks being over the cap, and his answer indicated that he's not taking it that seriously, which is totally fair because getting under the cap is going to be very trivial, and I think the team is going to easily do it within the next month. But there's one thing he said that I think got the attention of the Seahawks fans. And it got the attention of the Seahawks fans in a negative way. People don't really like what they heard, and I can understand why. I would say this. I'm going to go ahead and go through what he said. Let me just say, read the whole quote. There's one part of what he said, like one 2-sentence segment that got posted everywhere that people are running with. Don't just look at that one part. Look at the whole thing before you pass judgment here. Now, I'm not saying that the whole thing makes it all that much better. I'm not saying that the whole thing makes it good or okay, but I do think that it changes the way in which it's read in a way that makes it seem less problematic. I'll put it to you that way. I do think that if you take the whole thing that he said, it's more reasonable. Is it good? I don't know. I wouldn't go that far. But anyway, if you don't want to listen to the interview, I have Mike Dugar tweet on screen where he lists the entire spiel from Schneider. All, how many sentences is this? Probably more than a dozen, right? So we're going to take a look at that. And we're going to try to pull apart what he said. He spoke about the offensive line, and I mean, when it comes to this team and offensive line, fans are very sensitive right now, right? So you better have the right things to say here, or else you're going to get roasted. Before we go into the exact quote, though, I do want to tell you about my friends over at BetUS. BetUS is not just a sports book. They also have an online casino that you can utilize. If you like to play slots, if you like to play blackjack, hit up the casino portion of BetUS. They have live casino dealers, and don't forget to take advantage of BetUS's sign-up bonus, 200% up to $5,000, or 250% crypto sign-up bonus up to $5,000. So check them out, give them a shot. While you're making your sports bets, remember, they got the great sports book too. Check out the casino. Take advantage of the free money. Get to some gambling. Okay, so anyway, looking at the full thing that was said, let's go ahead and zoom in just on the question and answer portion of this. The question was, are there some positions that are better to address in free agency versus the draft? Looking at the offensive line, is that something better addressed with an experienced player or someone drafted and developed? So this is obviously something that Seahawks fans are pretty they're pretty glued into it, right? If you were a Seahawks fan and you were listening to this interview and you heard that question, you were probably like, "Oh, I'm really interested in hearing what John Schneider is going to say." So, I don't know if he really offers up a direct answer to the question anywhere here, but I think what he's trying to say is that the draft is better. That's the general gist of what he says. And he's right. The draft is better at every position. You always would prefer to build your team through the draft. If there was an NFL team out there that was so good at drafting that they never or almost never had to touch free agency, that would be a team that is doing a remarkable job and a team that is making their owner very happy, a team that has an incredible general manager, a team that is probably maintaining elite continuity every season, winning games, making the playoffs, winning the division, making playoff runs. Like, that's the dream. But that's also not reality. No team is that good at drafting. At least not for an extended period of time. You can be that good at drafting for a little bit, but odds are good at some point you're going to have to turn to free agency here. And that is kind of the general problem with what Schneider goes on to say here. What he says is it changes every year by position, except for the offensive line. Everybody is on this constant quest for offensive linemen and developing offensive linemen. So what he's saying is that some years, certain positions are going to be strong in the draft or weak in the draft, and strong in free agency or weak in free agency. I think we all understand that, right? Like, this year is a weak year for quarterbacks. 2021 was a weak year for quarterbacks. But 2023 was a strong year for quarterbacks. You have years that are strong for receiver, strong for corner, strong for defensive linemen, and then there are years where those areas are weak for those positions. And then he says the exception is the offensive line. And if you continue to go through the quote, to answer your question, every position changes every year based on depth, but the offensive line, there's always like a dearth of talent at the position. Supply and demand, right? So what he's saying is that there aren't enough good offensive linemen in the league. So when a team gets a really good offensive lineman, they don't let that player go unless something really strange happens or they literally cannot afford it. If you get that really good left tackle or left guard, or really any offensive line position except maybe right guard, I think, right now, and maybe center, you're not going to let that guy leave because it's so valuable to have him. I think that's what he's getting at here, and he is correct. When you talk to other teams, when you talk to other GMs about trades and stuff like that, or when our guys upstairs are talking to other teams, everybody kind of skips the offensive line. It's like a given. So basically, you can't get them. That's what he's trying to say. So what he's ultimately getting to is that free agency is not the solution. And what he says at the end here is the quote that people are really hung up on, and it certainly sounds bad. Free agency, you can't just throw money at something to fix a perceived need. We've made mistakes there in the past, and we're going to try not to repeat the mistakes we've made. So that's the part that people have objected to. That is the part that people don't feel so great about right now, I think. So what he's saying is that the offensive linemen that make it to free agency most of the time are offensive linemen that are not that good, or if they are good, or even if they're not good, they get overpaid. I think that's what he's trying to say here. So, therefore, the only way to get good offensive linemen is to draft and develop them. Now, for the most part, he's right. So, I'm not objecting to his general point. I'm not. It's hard to get good offensive linemen via trade. It's very rare a good one comes free. It's rare that one hits free agency. And usually, if they hit free agency, there's a reason for it. Like some people will talk about Trey Smith. I think the reason why he's hitting free agency is because Kansas City knows the big cap hits for guys like Chris Jones and Pat Mahomes are coming up soon. They don't want to pay massive money to another player, and they know that it's a right guard. It's replaceable. You can replace a right guard. You're not going to get something quite as good, but it's not going to kill your offense. So I get what he's saying on that front. Like that makes sense to me. Here's the problem. He says free agency, you can't just throw money at something to fix a perceived need. Now, I don't know why he uses the word perceived. It's not a perceived need in the case of the Seahawks, right? We've seen this offensive line for the last few years. It's not a perceived need. It's a clear and obvious definite need. And while this is true most of the time, it's not true all of the time. Look at the Chiefs after they lost the Super Bowl to Tampa Bay. They went out and threw all their resources into rebuilding the offensive line. And yes, some of that was through the draft, but there was also some of it where they went out and spent money. They went out and got a Joe Thuney. That guy cost a lot of money. And they were willing to get rid of other stuff on the team to get a player like a Joe Thuney. So that team, by the way, Tampa Bay would go on to win 2 more Super Bowls after signing Joe Thuney. So this is the part where, yes, it's not a common thing, but ignoring it completely is wrong. And the other big problem here is that, I'm sorry, I don't know how else to put this. The Seahawks have shown over the last several years, they are not necessarily the team that understands this development thing very well. So if there's any team that would need to consider trying to go the other way, it's probably the Seahawks. Like, look at Christian Haynes. That's a 3rd-round pick. Everybody said when we drafted Christian Haynes, this guy's ready to go. This guy's going to be a day 1 starter. This guy is already pretty much maxed out. What he is, he is. And he gets here and he can't even get on the field. He doesn't even look as good as our 2nd-string lineman. They're trying him at right guard. He looks completely out of his element. And now we're probably looking at moving his position to try to save his career. And I think that'll work. But the point is, that's a guy you were supposed to not even have to develop. That was a guy who was supposed to be ready to go out of the box, and he wasn't. So whether it was the development or whether it was the scouting, that was a complete disaster. And you don't see disasters like that happen on a lot of these other teams. That's just the most recent example, by the way. It's early, but we haven't seen any real development with Anthony Bradford. He's still just an athlete that can't really play the position. We tried and failed to develop a bunch of guys on the interior back in the Russell Wilson era. Guys like Drew Nowak and Christian Sokolai. A couple other guys I'm forgetting too. I think you guys remember what I'm talking about here. You know, we've tried to skate by with these very low-level players, getting a guy like a Laken Tomlinson, getting a guy like an Evan Brown, getting a guy like an Austin Blythe, and over and over again, we don't get the results that we want or need. So if there's one team out there that should say, look, we need to do it this way because we have been trying to do it the other way for so long and haven't had very good results, it's this team. What are our successes on the offensive line? Right? Charles Cross. Charles Cross has developed into a really good left tackle. I'm high on him. Abe Lucas, who has played a season and a half worth of games. We don't know for sure yet. He seems good. And Damian Lewis was okay. I mean, there were some bad seasons with Damian Lewis. There were like too good, too bad, and then he left. So even that is not some hitting it out of the park home run necessarily. Other than that, like the best offensive lineman the Seahawks have had in Schneider's era might be Dwayne Brown, right? Dwayne Brown, we traded for. We didn't draft that guy. We traded for him after he was established as a very good player. And then he has this one part in the middle of this quote where he's talking about the Super Bowl. You saw what happened in the Super Bowl, for crying out loud. You know, they're playing for a world championship and things didn't go well. That quote kind of makes me feel like the lesson he learned from the Super Bowl was you can spend a ton of money and invest a ton of resources into your offensive line, and they can still play atrocious football, which in that game was true, right? Chiefs have a very expensive offensive line. They invested high picks into guys like Kingsley Inigbare. I think that's his name. Or no, Kingsley Sumayataya. You guys know who I'm talking about. The left tackle the Chiefs drafted. He's not even ready to get on the field yet. So they bumped Joe Thuney out to left tackle, and he can't do it. They got Creed Humphrey out there on a $20 million a year deal, and he looks awful. They got, honestly, Trey Smith did not play well. And he's not expensive yet, but he is considered to be one of the best right guards in football. So that Chiefs team, they've made the investments, and they look that bad. That's the lesson you take away from that. To me, there's another side to this, which is, you know, they won the previous 2 Super Bowls, and they were playing in the Super Bowl this year, right? I think if the Seahawks make it to the Super Bowl this year, and then they get blown out in the Super Bowl like the Chiefs did, most Seahawks fans would be willing to live with that. You don't have to win the Super Bowl to make everyone happy. Progress, getting to the Super Bowl, winning the conference, I think most of us would be like, yeah, that's good. That's something that I'm pretty happy about. Getting blown out in the Super Bowl is unfortunate, but I'll deal with it if it means getting there. At least then I would be like, hey, you did your job. Yeah, maybe the offensive line didn't bring it in that one game, but I bet the offensive line played really good for us to get there. So if that's what he's looking at that game for in terms of knowledge, that's not great. That's not what I want to hear. So I still don't really like this quote. It does indicate that, yes, he knows it needs to get better. Yes, he knows he needs to add players. That part is good. I want to say that. I want to be clear about that. John Schneider does indicate in this quote that he understands they need to add on the offensive line. They need to add better players. But he's pushing back on the idea of spending top dollar to get them. And there's just no need to cut yourself off from that. And just because he says it here doesn't mean he's going to do it. I understand that. He may very well be saying this and then end up doing another thing. But the point I'm trying to make here is that there's no rule against it, and it can work. It's worked for other teams. It doesn't work all the time, but maybe it should work for this team this time. Thank you to BetUS for powering this video. See you guys later. Go Hawks.